All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is World War One, 1914. And we're going to talk about five terms that, as you read about this conflict, that is also known as the Great War, in many parts of the world, it's important to understand, right? There's a lot here. It's complex. So, let's dig into it. So the first thing for us to know is alliance systems. One of the many factors as to why World War I happened and why World War I happened when it happened was because of the complex series of alliance systems that existed prior to the start of the war. For example, I'm not going to name all of them, but for example, England has an alliance with France. France has an alliance with Russia. Russia has an alliance with Serbia. England and France want to guarantee or have an alliance, have a treaty with Belgium. Germany has a relationship with Austria-Hungary. There's a lot to this, okay? But the intention behind these alliance systems was to be able to provide a measure of political and economic and social balance in Europe in their 19th century. Because remember, Europe had gone through a lot with Napoleon and what he had been able to achieve. So there was a real feeling that there needed to be a system in place that would help to be able to prevent future Napoleons, from coming to power. So these are in place in 1914, where if an attack against one of these nations happens, it's possible that you're going to start to see all of these alliance systems get called in. And that's what occurs in this case. Secondly, an arms race. Right? Now, again, alliances and arms race are not the only two factors that led to World War I happening. There is also the role of nationalism and colonialism and industrialization, and there are many, many, many different factors that are at play here. But the arms race that existed in Europe and the wider world at the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century is important. What it contributes to is the kind of war that you're going to see and a proclivity to war that you're going to see in 1914. So an arms race, of course, usually means a buildup of military arms. The British Empire is the most powerful in the world at the point. The Germans are, of course, rising in terms of their power, having become a state by the early 1870s. So there are typically two figures or things to be aware of with this arms race. Certainly Alfred Thayer Mahan, hint, hint. He writes a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History that argues that if you want to be a big power, you got to have a strong navy. And the other term for us with that was something called dreadnoughts, which was a kind of ship, a big battleship that in the early 1900s kind of revolutionizes the kinds of big navies that Alfred Thayer Mahan would be talking about in the early 20th century. And so you start to see the Germans, the British, or certainly the Americans and others are going to get involved in trying to create these kinds of things. All right, our third term, assassination. So the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is a key factor to why the First World War happens when it does. So if the alliances and the arms race contributed to the political climate that out of which, if something happens, war is going to come, it's the assassination of the Archduke that is the thing that happens. So he's assassinated in Sarajevo in that summer. And his wife was assassinated with him in an assassination plot that was connected back to ultra-Serbian nationalists. Now, the plot itself, it would be quite haphazard but for the fact that it worked. The guy who actually does shoot him is a guy by the name of Gavrilo Princip, who becomes kind of favored in Serbian nationalist lore, but of course is, a terrible and tragic figure, not only for the Austro-Hungarians, but also for the war that ultimately does start and leads to the deaths of millions and millions. So Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. The Austro-Hungarians want to have a sense of justice. They want to come in and take over in Serbia. Serbia turns to their allies, and one thing leads to another, right? Serbia turns to their allies for support. Their allies step in. The diplomacy begins throughout July 1914. The British eventually get involved. They want to try to be able to stop a conflict from happening. but they are unable to do so. Germany issues something called the blank check, where they tell their ally, the Austro-Hungarians, that whatever choice they make, they're going to support them, and they do. And so this begins a European-wide war, which will eventually encompass the globe. Now, the fourth term for us is something called the Schlieffen Plan. Now, the Schlieffen Plan existed before the First World War, but it was a military plan on the part of the German General Staff, who the general's name was Schlieffen. The idea was to game out the possibility of a two-front conflict, so the Germans fighting two major wars at the same time, where you would attack one, then you'd put your soldiers on trains and then send them over to attack the other. Now, this is put into effect in 1914. What will happen is the German army plans an invasion of France, with the assumption being they would have to go through Belgium to do it, which they knew it would violate Belgian neutrality, but they understood that if they could knock France out of the war quickly enough, England would never have to come in, because England was duty-bound to protect Belgian neutrality. And they were going to they're going to take Paris basically by the 39th day of the invasion, and then put their guys on trains, send them right back to go attack Russia, because although the Russians have a very big army, that army would be too slow to mobilize. Now, the Schlieffen Plan is put into effect beginning in late July, early August 1914, and this leads us to our fifth point, and that is the First Battle of the Marne. Now, it's called the Marne Battle, or the Battle of the Marne initially, because the Second Battle of the Marne hadn't happened yet. It's fought in September of 1914, so for the 5th through the 10th, and up until that point, it was the biggest battle sort of that had ever really happened in the world. And what comes of it, of course, is the French forces, along with the British forces, are actually successful. So the Belgians put up a fight because, well, they're being invaded, and they slow down the German advance. This gives time for the British to kind of come online. There's a gap in the line between the French and the British forces. The Germans are not really able to kind of exploit that gap at the Battle of the Marne. And what happens is the stalemate of the Western Front that we tend to think of. So if you saw the movie 1917 and the lines and the no man's land and all of that, that stabilizes and is created as a result of the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the Battle of the Marne, which was won by the French and the British in 1914. Thanks so much.